On paper, the Aorus FO48U is possibly the best display you can buy right now. It offers 48 inches of 4K 120Hz OLED glory with 10-bit color, instant response times, obviously, and genuinely impressive speakers built in. But there's a catch. Actually, there's quite a few, enough that I went from being incredibly excited to have this in to test, to being somewhat put off from using it at all. There is a whole lot to unpack here, so strap in because this is going to be a long one. Let's start off with the specs, because like I said, this is, on paper, a fantastic looking display. In fact, it might be one of the best displays on the market right now. It is a 48-inch 3840 by 2160 OLED. It sports HDMI 2.1 ports, sadly not the full speed 48 gig, only 24 gigabits per second here, but still good enough for most uses, alongside a DisplayPort 1.4 ports and USB-C that supports DisplayPort Alt Mode and even Display Stream Compression or DSC. That USB-C port also means, in combination with the 2-port USB 3 hub, that this has a KVM built in, meaning you can hook up your keyboard and mouse to the display and have the display itself be the one to not only switch your video inputs, but also your controls inputs when you switch between devices. Again, on paper, the 95% coverage of the DCI-P3 spectrum should lead to an exceptional viewing experience. And of course, coupled with the infinite contrast ratio offered by the fact that each pixel can just outright turn itself off, you can display black very nicely, and content can look absolutely just stunning, awe-inspiringly beautiful. And, well, I mean, just look at this juicy steak bouncing on the grills, or maybe this fire in the woods. Both of those shots are just beautiful to look at. Unfortunately, once you start looking at brighter content, especially anything that is trying to display white across more than just a few pixels at a time, you will start to very clearly see the limitations. These jelly sweets that are bouncing in water are meant to be dropping onto a bright white background, but here it's very much grey. In fact, I'll superimpose half of the same frame on screen with the actual content so that you can see a side-by-side comparison of what it should like versus what it actually ends up looking like on this display. The white of the original clip becomes a more mid-grey and makes the viewing experience relatively lackluster, at least for that type of clip. The reason for this isn't that the OLED is incapable of displaying white. No, it's mostly thanks to the adaptive brightness limiter feature, which is actually the same thing that the LG C1 OLED that shares this same panel uses, but frustratingly, Gigabyte's approach here seems much more aggressive than LG's, and you can't disable that feature at all. In every picture mode, every option, everything that you can think of, it still happens. And when I say it's aggressive, this is what I mean. When you have a small, bright window, it can be plenty bright, upwards of 400 nits in the SDR settings, at least in my testing, or up to like 800 nits in HDR. But as the window grows, the brightness of the whole panel dims. Just look at the galaxy in the background. See how much less you can see when the Explorer window is almost full screen? It is a significant and noticeable difference, and worse, it's not that fast either. That means that for bright transitions, it still actually outputs a hefty amount of light, but only for about 50 milliseconds, meaning you just get flashed with bright light and then it dims back down again. You can actually see that really clearly in the response time graphs, where it jumps to 42% brighter and then slowly trails back down to the resting level, and it takes more than 200 milliseconds to do that, to actually come to a rest, meaning that that flash is sustained for well long enough for your eyes to notice it and be really distracting. it actually gets worse, because depending on what color precedes the bright shade, the one that I just showed was RGB 153 to 204, which is a pretty small and tight transition. You're going from, if you went from, say, RGB 0 to 255, well, that should be full white, but what you see is a flat line at the top of the graph because the panel far exceeds the brightness level that my OSRTT unit was expecting and is literally clipping over the top. This is easily 50% brighter, if not more, than what it ends up displaying as white, meaning that a dark to light transition in, say, a game or a film is visually unpleasant to watch. That limitation also means that the gamma curve, the balance of light to RGB values, to better match kind of how our eyes actually perceive brightness and color, is way off. The on-screen menu does have specific gamma options ranging from gamma 1.8 to 2.6, but they're all just utterly useless, because here's what I measured the gamma 2.2 curve to look like. Red is the actual data, and green is what it's meant to look like. See the problem here? Anything above RGB 153, just 60% of the color space or brightness space available, is functionally identical, making for a poor viewing experience for sure. It's worth noting that the menu also has options for contrast, a related feature to gamma. In fact, it has 3. In the picture menu, you have contrast, as you would expect, alongside brightness, and then you also have advanced contrast. And then if you go to the gaming mode, you have the black equalizer setting, which, as best as I can tell, is just changing the contrast or maybe the gamma curve. But either way, all of these settings, including those gamma settings, end up just competing and end up making your viewing experience worse, kind of no matter how you set it up. Since I mentioned the response times, it's worth actually talking about them. Of course, being an OLED panel, the response times are functionally instant, right around 1 millisecond or less. The problem here is the weird stuff that it does, like overshooting to the moon and back, as I mentioned, but also undershooting like crazy. Here's another graph, this time showing the same RGB 204 and 153, but this time it's going from the brighter 204 shade down to the darker 153 shade. Now, you see that? That is dropping to around RGB 110, around 43% less light for an entire 8 millisecond frame. It does the same thing from RGB 255 to 204, again for an entire frame. When it comes to actually gaming on it, it's definitely a more manageable experience than the test results would have you believe, although it's still definitely one of the overall less enjoyable gaming experiences that I've had. Of course, the instant response times, even if it fancies overshooting and undershooting for entire frames like crazy, does make it feel pretty snappy. The issues with brightness and contrast can make it rather difficult to strike a balance between being able to see in brighter areas and not having any shadowed spots be practically pitch black. For competitive games where you can sort of optimize for the darker areas and sacrifice a blown out skybox, that's fine, although for something a little more visual or story driven, that can be less ideal. Interestingly, on the note of motion clarity, the panel does support backlight strobing via their aim stabilizer mode, which can only be enabled when the refresh rate is over 100 Hz and with FreeSync disabled. With it on, it strobes the panel off and on, I think around 2000 times per second. This is rather different to the more standard strobing modes that opt to just turn the backlight off for all but 1 millisecond on each frame. Although thanks to the actual instant response times here, you do actually get a much smoother experience, even if I still end up with headaches from this sort of literal 2000 Hz flickering. When it comes to the colors, I've mentioned a few of the sort of issues so far, including the inability to display white on any more than a small portion of the screen, but it actually gets worse there too. while it's happy to cover 94% of the DCI-P3 spectrum in my testing in terms of gamut coverage, the accuracy is, in a word, atrocious. You can expect an average out-of-the-box delta E of over 10 in its standard mode, or worse, 11.5 in its sRGB mode. And that's on top of the only peak of 130 nits or so full screen brightness. Now, like I said, I did see up to around 400 or so nits with a tiny 2% window, when apparently it can hit up to about 800 nits in HDR as well. But for a lot of content, you can expect to only be seeing between 100 and 200 nits, regardless of your brightness settings. It is worth noting that this is actually an RGBW panel or pixel layout too, which means that text and fine details often look just a bit off. Take the text on YouTube. It has a noticeable green tinge on the back, and it looks just a touch unsharp, especially compared to a more conventional pixel layout, at least in Windows anyway. It's also interesting to take a look at what the pixels are doing here, as even on a bright white, it won't use all four colors. It refuses to light up the red subpixels to mix in with the white, blue, and green, even on its fairly warm white or normal profile. Since we're talking about the pixels, let's talk burn-in. It's arguably one of the biggest concerns most people have with OLEDs, and I think it's one of the areas where the most development, especially in the post-production space, has happened. Things like the automatic brightness limiter, the pixel shifting that actually isn't present here, or the wear leveling that is, all are sort of ways to help extend the lifespan of the panel and to make sure that things like burn-in doesn't happen. Sadly, despite the menu listing the panel's current lifetime usage at just 280 hours, my unit already has burn-in. The Windows taskbar, specifically the shadow above it that it casts on windows around, and actually some random file names from the desktop or the desktop icons there, are burned in. They are visible on mostly uniform backgrounds, and sure, you likely won't notice them most of the time, but the fact that after just 280 hours of usage it already has this level of wear is concerning. That also lines up with the experience that Wendell talked about in an LTT video last year with his LG CX OLED. Now, as a bit of an addendum here, since actually writing the script, thanks to the sort of automatic wear leveling stuff that it does when you turn the display off and then leave it off for enough time, most of the burn-in that's here has at least somewhat gone away, or it's a lot less visible. That is a great sign and means that the panel is more likely to survive longer than at least I initially expected. Although, again, the fact that it had any burn-in at all after just 280 hours is less than ideal. Of course, I don't know what scenario this display was used in for those 280 hours. If it was just sat on the desktop the entire time, then sure, I could understand, although it is worth noting that not only does it have the automatic brightness limiter, but it also has automatic dimming over time, where I think after something like 5 minutes it dims the display by 30%, after 10 minutes it dims it by 50%, and then after just 15 minutes it goes to a Aorus text screensaver, and you can also set the menu to turn the display fully off after 10, 20 or 30 minutes. But speaking of the LG CX OLED, I think that brings us nicely onto the competition here. Well, of course, there are plenty of conventional LCD-based options like the Acer CG437KS that I reviewed relatively recently, or even the Philips Momentum 55. Those have their own problems, like horrifically slow response times thanks to their relatively slow VA panels. So let's stick with OLEDs. The LG C1 OLED that I've mentioned throughout this video, the one that I believe shares either the same or a very similar panel to this one, can be had for £400 less. And for arguably a better display with full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, admittedly no DisplayPort 1.4 or USB-C KVMs, but likely a better overall usage experience too. Alternatively, you can pick up the brand new next generation LG C2 48-inch OLED for around £250. Less than this too. And like, why wouldn't you? I really wanted to love the FO48U. I really did. I specifically requested this sample from Gigabyte because I really wanted to try it out. But, well, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. Sure, in the right conditions, in the right, footage or game, whatever else, this can be a visually stunning panel and a snappy gaming experience for sure, but it doesn't take much to take it from a great experience to a far from perfect one instead. A single bright scene burning your retinas for 50 milliseconds, then being too dim to distinguish 40% of the entire RGB range is not a fun experience, and not one that I would want to pay considerably over the competition for. I must admit that I am also a little confused who the target market for this display is. In theory, this could be the ultimate desktop monitor, right? It's as wide as an ultra-wide, it's also got the extra vertical real estate, so if you do want to use this as your standard desktop monitor, in theory you could. But the fact that when you snap any level of window to your full screen, especially a brighter window, and then it gets a kind of nasty shade of grey instead of white like it should be, then it's just less than ideal. And also, when I've been sitting this close to it, 4K at this sort of distance does look just a little less crisp than perhaps I would like. With that said, those are my thoughts, but I would love to hear yours in the comments down below. What do you think of the FO48U? Is it a display that you would pick up yourself? Do you not mind the adaptive brightness limiter and the sort of limitations of the panel? Or would you go with the LG C2 OLED instead, especially now that is out and available and is a new generation of panel on top of all that? Or would you just stick with a more standard display, maybe something more conventional like a 27-inch display instead? Feel free to let me know in the comments down below. If you want to pick up a FO48U, or maybe just check out pricing when and where you watch this, I'm going to leave a global Amazon affiliate link in the description that you can take a look at. You can also support the channel by just hitting the subscribe button and turning on the bell notification icon so you don't miss any of these videos from me, or you can also check out the rest of the links that are in the description. You can pick up a hoodie or t-shirt like this one or a load of other designs I made myself, or you can check out the other affiliate links for places like Overclocked UK if you're buying from there, and there's also going to be plenty of other videos on the end cards you can check out. Maybe check out the CG437KS review I did recently if you want to take a look at something at least somewhat comparable, even if not directly. Otherwise, thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you all in the next video.